Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Underground. This is the briefing for Tuesday, the 30th of November, 2021, and as always, it is being recorded on the day prior, the 29th of November. So let's get started. Moving quickly through the weather, we can see that winter weather is definitely a factor for most of the United States, as one might expect this time of year, but this combined with a lot of the low-level clouds that we're going to be seeing in some parts of the country up near the northern border, along with the very dark nights. We're only at a 28% illumination level, and the moon is going to be setting at 2:32 in the afternoon, so it makes for some pretty dark nights moving forward. And we can see here on our surface winds chart that we have lots of winter weather advisories in the northern areas. So let's move on to NOTAMs. Really nothing particularly special. There is a presidential one for Minneapolis, but by the time this briefing goes out, it will be expired. It's just Biden is taking a visit to Minnesota to talk about infrastructure, something like that. Doesn't really matter for NOTAMs. Just wanted to point that out because that's really the only one that there is of note. Moving into our civil unrest forecast, really at this point this slide is becoming a kind of a dated item because really we're seeing violence and just general crime and looting and things like that in most major U.S. cities on things like weekends or whenever there's some kind of policing action, even if it's not anything this high profile. We see random things happen like that, and especially the states which have basically legalized shoplifting. This is a huge thing, so it's just become a daily thing of a facet of daily life for a lot of people in most major cities. But really, we're not tracking any huge major events that are either planned or really it's stuff that we can't really predict with any reliability. At least we can't. So, yeah, there's really not much to say on the civil unrest forecast other than to say that most American cities are not doing super hot right now. So let's move on to logistics. So for logistics, really not a whole lot of updates. There are really no major changes from the last brief. However, there are some changes on the national level shortages. So moving forward into this kind of new slide we've set up here, there are two things to note. One is ammonia. So fertilizer shortages continue to be a huge problem globally. This is not just the United States. The United States is actually doing not so bad when compared to the rest of the world when it comes to fertilizer shortages. But the United States is most likely going to start feeling the shortages of ammonia pretty soon, because in Europe, the price of ammonia is already up 300% since January. So again, inflation and just high prices skyrocketing globally on pretty much everything are definitely playing a factor here. But the production of ammonia, the raw materials needed to produce it, the agriculture that's also needed to produce it, that's a huge thing that drives prices up. And then also, switching gears quite significantly, there is also a maple syrup shortage. So this is kind of a weird one. The Quebec Maple Syrup Producers Organization is releasing over 50 million pounds of maple syrup from their strategic reserves, which is a headline that I wish I was making up. But interestingly enough, the Canadian maple syrup market operates much like OPEC in that they have very specific production and distribution timelines to keep the international price of maple syrup stable. Like, this is a very much a precious commodity for most of the world, so they have very much an OPEC-like organization. And earlier this year, the market experienced a pretty big hiccup in the weather. It's just the growing season, the harvest season for really maple syrup was not super great this spring, which reduced production, and this has resulted in roughly half of Canada's strategic maple syrup reserve being released to keep prices stable. So we're really not sure how this is going to affect things, but if you like genuine maple syrup, you might notice that it's kind of hard to find in the grocery stores. Although they're releasing the strategic reserve, so I guess we'll figure out how that plays into it. I just thought that was kind of interesting when we get to some of the critical infrastructure concerns for this brief. So let's go ahead and jump into the mandate updates. This is just kind of a quick heads up as to the situation with the mandates, right? So as many of you already know, the White House has announced a new wave of authoritarianism in the form of yet another mandate. So we've already talked about these other two right here, these two mandates previously, but we now have a new one. This is the mandate that just came out. The gist of which is that every truck driver that crosses a U.S. land border will have to be jabbed, no exceptions. Now, I still keep that in heavy air quotes because, as is a classic Biden tactic, going back to his very first years in the Senate, nothing is in writing just yet. At least not yet, right? So we don't really know how this will work out because, again, this is not in writing. Now, even the casual observer can clearly see that Biden's tyrannical overreaches have been halted by many courts at this point, and this mandate would certainly fall under the category of a court saying not to do something, and Biden or the White House is going against the court. Like, it's pretty clear at this point that the Biden regime, while actually very hesitant to actually give any opposition room to stand on, it's also clear that the regime's propaganda and coercion tactics are waning, and the Biden regime has made it quite clear that they will not hesitate to use force when that propaganda becomes less effective. So like I mentioned, there's nothing in writing with this. There's no executive action on this. OSHA is basically in the doghouse right now with the federal courts because they're the ones who are taking the heat for Biden's tyrannical mandates. But when it comes to like what this actually means, nobody really knows because this is a pretty classic tactic. Biden knows, or the regime, I guess, collectively, knows that whenever he does something tactile, like an executive order, this can easily be immediately stopped by a court. But if he, or the other people that are running or influencing things, doesn't put anything in writing, if he puts out a press release, or hops on Twitter and just signals to the media what the White House's interests are, well, that can become a self-fulfilling tyranny machine right there, which is exactly what happened with the OSHA mandates, right? These ones that are on the slide already, right? Biden didn't actually put anything in writing for months after mandating the jab for companies with over 100 employees. And yet, even though he didn't put anything in writing, these companies and entities went out of their way to follow a law that didn't even exist yet. So, and arguably doesn't even exist to this day because it's not a law, right? So employees get fired because a company is following an executive order that didn't even exist yet. One of Biden's well-known tricks, and a trick that this regime uses first, this is like their primary weapon, right, is just throwing out a statement and seeing what people will do. They just throw out these mandates and see what sticks. If the end result is people following it, Biden gets a freebie. He gets people to do what the regime says. He gets people to do what he says. And at the same time, no court can come after him because he didn't put anything in writing. So, just like we talk about all the time, a lot of people these days are absolutely salivating at the prospect of using the "we were just following orders" excuse. That just seems to be the case, at least from what we think. It's quite literally the Milgram experiment all over again, except there's a big difference, that the participants fully know about all the details of the experiment, and they are actively wanting to participate in it. And to continue the analogy, it's almost like a lot of people have the attitude of, hey, Mr. Labcoat Man, come back in here and sort of intimidate me a little bit so that I can have an excuse to flip this last switch. It's like people are begging to flip that last switch. Which is kind of scary, but I say all of this to hopefully explain how we here look at a lot of these mandates, press releases, executive orders, whatever, and what all of this means for the nature of, authority in general, I guess, but really this is just an important thing to think about when it comes to trying to figure out a livelihood that is more resistant to the crazy stuff that we're dealing with these days. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that for a minute because it requires a lot. It's not just as simple as, is this constitutional or not? Is this legal or not? Is this a law or not? It's not that simple because we're starting to, again, like I've mentioned many times before, we're examining the nature of what a law actually is. We're examining the nature of what an executive order actually is, or what a court order actually is. And yeah, sure, it's dangerous, but hey, look, we're having to deal with this on a daily basis. So I thought I'd kind of take that digression to help kind of explain what the mindset that we're in when it comes to this stuff. So with that out of the way, let's talk about some critical infrastructure concerns. And right up front, right up top there is the trucking mandates, right? Just like I mentioned, how are How is the trucking industry and how are most truckers going to respond to this mandate? Well, I think it's quite clear. The CEO of the American Trucking Association has stated that their internal polling has indicated that over 37% of all truckers in the United States, or at least in their association, are saying not only not, quote, not no, but hell no to these mandates. So, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? Like, we're here not in the trucking industry, but look, like, we've got family and friends and things like that work in logistics, and hey, look, it's quite clear that the power of trucking cannot be understated. Like, the people look down on that job a lot, but hey, look, we're finding out just how much power your average trucker has, and it's quite significant, and it's going to be interesting to see how much that affects things, because we're in this grand game of chicken when it comes to these mandates, and quite clearly it's becoming a lot more clear that the federal government thinks that like the truckers, the doctors, the military service members, they think that the people that they command are going to blink first, and that could not be further from the truth. Doctors and pilots and service members are willing to all end their careers before they comply with these mandates. And of course, we're not talking about most. We're not talking about most people, but hey, we're seeing levels of resistance that I will admit surprise me. I would never have thought that this many people would have resisted things even just now, right? And the resistance is growing every day. So I thought that was an interesting thing to note when it comes to critical infrastructure. Basically, hey, be prepared for trucking shortages to get worse. And then number two there, moving on to the energy sector. So Biden is, or at least the regime has stated that they are going to release 50 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to combat the high gas prices. And the interesting thing is that this makes absolutely no sense, because at the same time, the Biden regime is begging OPEC to increase production, which makes no sense whatsoever, because if the United States is going to flood the market with oil, then why would OPEC increase production? They're going to cut production so that the price of gasoline doesn't go down to 2 cents a gallon, and so that they will have actually some profit, because as people like to look at these big oil companies and say, oh, they're just evil corporations, right? And you can make that case in a lot of different areas, but the interesting thing is that when you have price manipulation or the market saturation when it comes to oil change so significantly, like if we were to drop the price of oil in half, because gas is like double what it used to be. It's like, gosh, 4 or 5 gallons in some parts of the country that we're in, and $9 a gallon in California and places like that. So if you were to drop that gasoline, if you were to flood the market with petroleum and drop that gasoline down to 50 cents a gallon, people would probably be generally happy, but that would decimate the oil industry, because what the oil industry is going to do is lay off everyone, and they're going to not have the production capability. So you have a short period of time where your gas prices are low, but then the gas prices skyrocket because you've messed with the system too much, too quickly. And that's what OPEC is looking at Biden like he's the slow kid in class. OPEC is like cracking jokes about this at this point. Like, hey, dude, what are you doing? Even Russia is like, yeah, man, we're going to cut production. Like, why are you releasing strategic petroleum reserves? Like, you could have just asked us to increase production. It's almost like OPEC is cracking jokes like, hey, you want more oil, pump it yourself, because you're the one who cut production in the United States. Like, we were energy independent for so long. Like, why are you looking to OPEC to fix the problem? So this is kind of one of those things that we could talk about forever when it comes to the energy sector. But really the interesting side note, specifically when it comes to the relationship between the Biden regime and the energy sector, is this. I know that the fashionable thing to do is to just bash Biden, right? That's just a popular opinion these days, and I get it. I really do. There's plenty of justification for that. But at the same time, in most cases, we can't just say, well, Biden's dumb or he's mentally incompetent. We can't just say that and call it a day. Sure that you can argue that these things are true, but after all, Biden does have a very long reputation in the Senate for stuff like this. He's not known in the Senate before he became vice president. He was not known for being a smart man, but generally speaking, the Biden regime has done some pretty smart stuff. I mean, smart if you're trying to be a dictator, but there are definitely lots of indicators that show that at least some kind of thought process is going on. But all of this being said, to me, the Biden regime's actions in the energy sector just don't make very much sense to me. I just can't figure out the angle. You can take all the usual talking points and make an argument. Like, yeah, you can do that. Like, Biden is trying to bankrupt the petroleum industry to appeal to the hippies and yuppies in the Democratic Party's base, which makes, honestly, that argument makes no sense to me, because the energy sector makes life possible, and they have a lot of power, like a huge amount of power, whereas the base that Biden would be appealing to can't really do anything for him. And then things get even more complex, like you start talking international diplomacy and things like that, which, again, truthfully is not Biden's strong suit. It's just not. Things get really complicated. I generally think that on issues like this, it's pretty clear that this is not so much of a political thing. It's not left versus right when it comes to the higher echelons of national energy policy. It's just not. It's factions, right? It's this company against that company. It's these cronies over here versus those cronies over there. It's favors and retirement plans versus other people's favors and retirement plans. That's just the way politics works at the highest echelons in general, and especially when it comes to national level energy stuff. But I can't figure out for the life of me why Biden, if he wanted to be a dictator, which he clearly does, or at least the regime collectively does, right? Why does he consistently stab the energy sector at every chance he gets? I mean, if it's to appease his political base, well, he can appease most voters with a Klondike bar. All I'm saying is that it seems like the intense targeting and alienation of a valuable wartime industry like the energy sector is not a good idea if Biden wants to have control. So all of this seems like a misstep on the regime's part, or whoever's exerting influence on the White House over these issues. Again, most people will just chalk this up to him being a crazy old man or a puppet for somebody else, and that's probably partially true, right? But I just have a gut feeling that something is not quite right with this, especially with how specifically and fervently the energy sector is being targeted. There are probably lots of different answers to this weird analytical note, so I thought I would share that thought, lay everything out on the table in the event that someone else out there has been kind of casually thinking the same thing, right? I'm sure if I dedicated, a few days to this, I could probably figure out what the angle is, but I just don't have the time to figure out what the White House is doing on when it comes to the energy sector and who knows who and all that kind of stuff. So I just thought it was kind of interesting, and hopefully somebody else out there is thinking kind of along the same lines, because I think it's kind of odd. There's something going on there that's a little weird, and I haven't been able to quite figure out why the hatred so much. But anyway, let's move on to significant governmental actions. So as everyone's probably heard by now, there is a new variant of the virus out there that cannot be named, right? I think the most interesting part, which is being sort of joked about all over the internet, is that the WHO in their naming convention skipped over the letter of the Greek alphabet, that they use that as the naming convention to avoid offending the Chinese Communist Party, because one letter of the Greek alphabet actually just so happens to be the first name of their dear leader. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It's very, very interesting, honestly, and it kind of points us to what the WHO's kind of mentality is. There's really not much intel value there, other than I thought it was interesting. But yeah, it just kind of chose to go that the WHO clearly is making political decisions, and has been for probably ever, honestly. Moving on to number 2 there, the case for Biden's nominee for the office of comptroller. Not looking so good for that nomination process. Sola Omrova recently had a background check done on her, and somebody figured out that she was actually arrested back in 1995 for shoplifting. Again, not a really huge intel value here. I just thought that I have not seen anything quite as ironic and honestly tragically poetic than Biden's economics nominee being charged with theft. I just thought that was kind of hilarious and sad at the same time, so I thought I would share that as well. But moving on to kind of number 3 and 4 there, which are kind of linked to sort of the same idea, is that Texas is not doing super great right now when it comes to their battle against CRT. So one school board in Texas decided to use their own law enforcement agents, basically school resource officers, to go and arrest parents at their homes and charging them with disorderly conduct with the intent to disrupt a public meeting. Again, this is not surprising for anyone who's got skin in the game, or anyone who's just kind of casually observing this. This is a pretty fierce fight. Like if we look at all of the sectors in which this kind of CRT woke stuff, whatever you want to call it, communist takeover, like look at where it's at. Like, is it in? Look at what industries it's at. It's really in education, right? We've known that universities have been kind of havens for this kind of stuff for a long time. But like looking at CRT being taught to like preschoolers, that's kind of not good, at least in our opinion. And a lot of people are kind of figuring that out, and it's very, very important to kind of propaganda, like just propaganda 101. This is, what do we call it now? Information operations, right? We kind of church it up a little bit to make it not sound as bad. But if you're trying to conduct intelligence operations or information operations against a population, if you're trying to topple a government, you really need to get the kids. You need to get them young. You need to get them questioning things very, very early, and questioning the things that you want them to question, and thinking the things that you want them to think. So again, this is very interesting from a doctrinal standpoint. We can get way down in the weeds with it, I guess, someday. But I thought it's kind of interesting that ordinary parents are starting to look at what their kids are bringing home for homework, and they're starting to figure this stuff out. Like, hey, yeah, we've been kind of talking about this stuff for a while, and it's good you're on board, but hey, this has been going on for a while. We're also seeing things like point number 4 there. We're starting to see these racial equity board members doxing parents who are suing to kind of stop this CRT training. The fact that a school has a racial equity board, what? Like what? There are so many things that, like, if you take a few classes, or if you study like the history of the Soviet Union quite significantly, particularly when it comes to other, maybe not traditionally Russian countries, but other countries that kind of, like Vietnam's a great example, China is another good example. If you start studying this stuff and starting to realize how communism kind of spread its tentacles everywhere, and how it got kind of started in some of these areas, it's very fascinating. Because you start seeing the sort of political commissars come out, right? They all have different names, right? But you start seeing these political organizations come up and kind of eclipse the ordinary things. Like, we've all heard of school boards, right? Like, school boards have been around forever, right? But, these racial equity boards, right? These, what do they call it? Racial trauma advocates. You're like, what? What is this? So it has that sort of, I'm not saying there's a direct link, but it's pretty clear that there's a flavor of political commissar type behavior in a lot of our educational systems. And Texas is finding that out the hard way right now, or at least Texas parents are. So, this is not something that's unique to Texas, of course. This is happening in the school that's like 2 miles from my house. So it's quite clear that this is a nationwide problem, but I do think that, in digressing on this topic yet again, I think that it's interesting to kind of understand a lot of the history that goes into this kind of stuff, because, again, from a doctrinal perspective, from an information operations perspective, it's utterly important to understand this stuff. Then moving on to number 5, they're just kind of a heads up, just a reminder that the Ghislaine Maxwell trial is currently underway. There's no media coverage of it, and this is going to be, most people kind of know how this is going to turn out, but I just wanted to point out that it's going on, and the mainstream media is trying to bury this. quite harshly, just like they're trying to bury the story of the terror attack that occurred at the Christmas parade, right? So it's like 'tis the season for censorship, I guess, and kind of hiding terrorist attacks and things like that. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that did happen. The Met trial is underway, and I guess we'll have to see how it works out. There's really nothing more to add on that. And before we move on, I wanted to talk about this again because I guess today is kind of a blend of an Intel update and a sort of podcast about deeper issues than just a standard, Intel update. But I thought this was interesting, and this is something that has kind of, depending on what parts of the internet you go on to, this is kind of blowing up. Other places are not talking about it at all. But this specific Wikipedia article is drawing a lot of attention. And this is the article for the mass killings under communist regimes. Now, the interesting part is that if you can quite clearly see that this article is being considered for deletion in accordance with Wikipedia's deletion policy. So, a lot of, I would say, more conservative sources are are citing this somewhat correctly, that Wikipedia is trying to censor the deaths that have been caused by communism. They're essentially that Wikipedia is trying to rewrite history by allowing this article to be kind of disappeared, right? And okay, that's interesting enough as is, and we can talk about that endlessly, right? But this is the interesting part to me. So if you go and you look right here, it says this article has multiple issues. Please help improve it or discuss these issues on the talk page. So if you click that link and go to the talk page, this is the page that comes up, and this is the part that's fascinating. Wikipedia is tracking the number of media organizations that cover this article. This is interesting. So what? This is this is crazy, right? This is the interesting part to me. Not the fact that Wikipedia wants to delete articles. Wikipedia deletes articles all the time. Some rightfully so, because they're dumb pages. But, arguably, this is the interesting part to me. We can make the argument that, okay, the page might not have been the best source of research. It's Wikipedia, right? So it's not exactly a scholarly source, right? But the interesting thing is that Wikipedia is not only tracking this, right? They literally are tracking these Reddit pages that are bringing in high traffic, a lot of traffic from these different websites. That's fascinating to me. Not only is Wikipedia aware that an article is being tracked by media organizations, but also they are tracking the websites that are talking about a Wikipedia article. Man, if that is not just a poetic note, again, tragically ironic note, considering the topic, considering that this is about communism and stuff like that, holy cow, I thought that was insane. So again, not really a whole lot of intel value, I guess, other than just to sort of show, man, how far this stuff goes. And I thought that was quite interesting, so I again thought I would talk about it some. So let's move on to another interesting slide, which is developing technologies. So there are really only 3 items of note, and all 3 are kind of military. The first one there is France's new camouflage system. So this is called the Adaptive Multispectral Camouflage System, aka the Salamander Camouflage. Don't know why they didn't call it Chameleon Camouflage. Missed opportunity there, I guess. But this is supposed to be debuted actually today or tomorrow, maybe. France has a national, once a year defense trade show, and they're supposed to be debuting it. So really all we have is this old video of it, but you can see it's kind of interesting. The US has obviously been working on this kind of technology for a while as well. I think BAE Systems has also got something. Lockheed has got something similar to this. Raytheon has got something. I think most defense contractors have some kind of technology. They're working on this kind of cloaking stuff. The stuff the US is doing is pretty cool. But yeah, this is the reason that I wanted to talk about it, is that this is supposed to be fully mission capable by now. So I don't know if that's true or not. I know that based on the calendar timeline and the kind of excitement that there's been along in the French military communities as, this might actually be capable for them now. Who knows? But moving on to the interesting ones, which are number 2 and 3, and they both have to do with Russian tanks. So these videos and pictures started showing up a few days ago, maybe a couple weeks ago, of Russian tanks in the Ukraine area, really the Donbass and Donetsk fighting areas, right, with the Russian buildup there. We're starting to see these interesting modifications being done. And this is something that's not particularly new, but the implementation is new, if it makes sense. So these cages on top of the turret there, like those aren't particularly new. Or at least the idea isn't new. These are used to protect against things like shaped projectiles, RPGs, really any kind of shaped projectile. That's what it's for. But usually it's on the side or the front of the tank, right, to prevent a side-on, RPG from hitting the side. Like every, veteran in the U.S. military has seen these. Like this is just kind of a thing that's standardized. Really, this goes back to World War II. Like the German Panzers had them, the T-34s had them, or some kind of shaped projectile disruption tool, right? So these cages aren't new. What's interesting is that they're on top of the turret, and they're nowhere else. So a lot of analysts are thinking that really what these are being used for on the tops of tanks and on the turrets are to prevent and disrupt the effectiveness of munitions like mortars and grenades that are dropped by drones, like these small like DJI drones. This is interesting. This is a new implementation of such technology. Now, a lot of people, I should point out that a lot of people think that these cages on the tops of turrets kind of angled like that are to disrupt, or at least maybe serve as kind of like a Hail Mary prevention against something like a javelin. And that kind of makes sense, but I don't know. That could be just a placebo. I can't imagine that stopping or even reducing the effectiveness of a freaking javelin. But you never know. Who knows? It might just be... the Russians are really good at deception too, right? They might put $200 worth of scrap steel on top of a tank to make analysts like me think about it for a while. It could be that. Don't really know. But it seems to be very interesting, and we've seen a lot of use of these small UAS platforms that are dropping very small mortars, but they're being devastatingly effective. I can't really think of any other use for these kinds of cages that are on tops of turrets, other than, okay, maybe some built-up areas, but, Donetsk and really, Ukraine has, a lot of Krishchevina houses that are like, 6 stories tall or 5 stories on the ground floor. That makes sense. If you're in an urban built-up area, the top of the tank is very vulnerable because the armor's not as thick as on the front or the sides or even the rear, right? But at the same time, I don't know. It just seems like it's meant to prevent against small UAS attacks. So, I guess we'll have to see. We'll have to see if once these go into combat service, maybe get some battle damage on them, we can kind of understand what the deal is with these. And then finally, the third point here, which is probably why I'm going to make a fool out of myself, but I was genuinely confused with this, and a few other people who are in the game, a few other analysts here in the shop as well, are confused by this. And this is something that appears to be a thermal emitter being observed on a lot of Russian tanks. So this image hopefully shows a little bit more clear what I'm talking about when it comes to this thermal emission device. And this is kind of a weird thing, so bear with me. And this image is also confusing, but because we have 3 T-72s, right, that are driving towards the camera, but the turrets for the T-72s are turned to the rear. So that's why it looks kind of odd. You might have trouble recognizing these, but you're definitely looking, you can see the driver's periscope right there, the normal distinctive lights and weld points and things like that you can use to figure out if this is a T-72 or a T-80 or a T-90. It looks pretty much like a T-72 to me, just with the turrets turned to the rear, to show us this weird-looking snorkel device. So there's here's the gist of what this might be. So a lot of people think that this is just a standard snorkel for like an engine air intake, right? And it is Obviously mounted to the turret so that you don't hit it when you traverse the turret around, but it's turned sideways, right? So that instead of being able to allow the tank to drive across a river or something like that, or traverse a river, right? Instead of being able to do that, it's actually holding a thermal emission device. And what the theory, at least on this, is that it serves as kind of like a little arm as a support to hold out a really hot source of heat, right? And the goal, or at least the theory, is that the Russians might be doing this as sort of like a field expedient way of putting a hot source of heat outside of the tank, so that if you had some kind of heat-seeking missile, it would zoom right past the tank's turret, zoom right past the hull of the tank, and explode harmlessly behind the tank, because it's trying to go for this hot source of heat rather than the exhaust that normally would be the target of a heat-seeking missile. Now, I'm not a tank guy, so I might be all wrong about this. I'm sure some Cav dudes are laughing their butts off, because it's probably quite simple. It's probably a simple solution, like just a tank snorkel or something they've got folded down for transport. Who knows, right? I'm not a tank guy, but these images, particularly this image here, is getting a lot of traction in kind of the OSINT world as to, like, what does this thing do? Because it doesn't appear to be a standard snorkel. It appears to be something else. So it's very interesting. I don't know what this does. I think that it's an interesting concept. I can't imagine it working very well. But I do find it to be very, very interesting that we're starting to see a lot of this stuff come out as Russia continues their build-up in the Ukrainian region. So very interesting stuff. Hopefully we'll get some more pictures of this and be able to talk about it a lot more, but I thought it was kind of interesting, and I guess we'll have to see how it goes and see what this thing actually is, because it's pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and move on to the National Guard stuff. Right, so in the Northeast, really not a whole lot going on. Really, the New York National Guard is still using both medical personnel and non-medical personnel to supplement all the people that have been fired from hospitals in the New York City area. So we'll hopefully get some more information on that, but that just appears to be continuing. Moving down southeast, there's really only one update, and that is to do with Kentucky. So this is probably outdated at this point, even though Kentucky's National Guard Adjutant General and PAOs have stated that they're still doing the medical mission. This doesn't appear to be accurate, because several battalions of the 149th MEB specifically are currently in the stages of mobilizing for a pretty big deployment to the Horn of Africa to support that mission. So based on the pre-deployment workups we've been observing for the past couple of weeks and months, I guess, around the state of Kentucky, it's a pretty big deployment. So the number of people that are stuck helping with the domestic medical mission has got to be pretty low. If they might be leaving behind some support personnel, who knows? I just wanted to point that out, that there's probably not a big mission in Kentucky anymore. Everywhere else, the mission remains the same. Really no major changes either way, so we're just going to kind of assume that the mission is continuing with all these other places. Similar situation in Wisconsin. We're assuming that the National Guard, since we haven't really seen much about the National Guard being, they were stood up for the whole Rittenhouse trial thing, and we really don't know if they're still around. We don't know how many units have been kind of stood up for that security role type stuff, so we're just going to assume that they're kind of still hanging out in the area, because the situation in Wisconsin is still pretty dynamic. So I don't know, we'll probably keep an eye on that for a while. The concern with Ohio National Guard potentially using National Guard members as school drivers, that concern is kind of waning, because it was probably just a political threat in the beginning, but you never really know, so we were tracking that. And then the Minnesota deployment continues as well. Down south of the border, a lot of deployments by the Texas National Guard, the Texas Guard, and a lot of other states' National Guards who have sent troops down to the southern border. That situation is pretty much status quo. It's status quo in that it's getting worse every day with regards to the violence and the number of people and the situations that are happening. Right, it's just kind of deteriorating. It's not deteriorating at an abysmal rate, but it is a concern, right? So just wanted to point that out, that we're probably likely to see a lot more forces move into the area as the winter sets in. And then out west, no real major change. The Oregon National Guard mission is probably going to wind to a close here pretty soon, just because politicians are getting involved. But other than that, not really not a whole lot going on. And moving on to the mask mandates. So really no major change to this. Again, the situation in Tennessee is kind of fluid. We're still trying to kind of figure out what's going on. Like, did the judge block this or did the judge not block it? Like, what's the deal? We're still going to keep Tennessee red because it appears that most of the school districts, or at least the biggest ones, are requiring masks for school. Especially with this new freaking hype over this new variant, right? So that's going to be a thing. We're expecting to see a lot more states probably locked down because of this, just for general reasons. Like, this is, a softball assessment. You could see this coming a mile away, right? So not exactly a surprise to anyone. But moving forward to the actual jab mandates, we're not really seeing anybody try to push this super hard. We're seeing a couple of states, even states that we were expecting to have jab mandates, they're kind of backing off now because they've seen the resistance in California, and people are finding out that, hey, you can't propagandize and pump propaganda into a child's head if a parent decides to homeschool them, right? And they kind of need to work both sides of the aisle with that if they want to keep these kids in school, right? So it's a huge thing. It's really an emotional topic for a lot of people. But we're, of course, continuing to keep an eye on the school situation and figure out what's going on there. And then overall, the resistance tracker is really unchanged, not a whole lot going on. I should say there's a lot going on, but we're at 9,000 RPMs, but we're in neutral, right? So we're just kind of waiting for the courts to see what's going to happen with a lot of these states, lawsuits and stuff like that. A few states it's going to be interesting to see what states do about these new mandates with trucking, particularly states like Texas. A lot of trade comes through the land borders into Texas from Mexico. So going to be interesting to see how that works out. But for now, really not a whole lot of updates. And then we do have an update to the mandate failure slide. So just to clarify a little bit, this new slide is meant to track the companies and entities that have been forced to rescind their medical mandates due to people resisting, right? This is not a tracker of all of the companies that are openly and proudly resisting, right? Those are everywhere at this point. We would just fill the slide up. We're tracking the companies where the company itself was forced to make a decision to not push these mandates based on their workers resisting. So all of these companies wanted to push mandates, right? Or they did push mandates, and their employees stopped that. And new to the list is Disney. So Disney had a jab mandate, and which has since been rescinded. So that's interesting, considering Disney's. Man, that's a whole rabbit hole I guess you could go down. But Disney itself is a very interesting organization, and the fact that they rescinded their jab mandate for their employees, or at least they've appeared to. This might just be a ruse, and they're covertly bringing it back in style. Who knows? But I did want to highlight that because that seems to be kind of interesting. So hopefully we'll have some more additions for this next brief. So let's move on to international issues. So wrapping things up here with international issues, we have a lot of things to talk about. This is doing kind of an injustice to not dedicate as much time to this, but if you look at the list of countries on the left-hand side of the screen there, I'll just list them off really quickly. Ireland, Italy, Greece, the Czech Republic, France, the Solomon Islands, Niger, Slovakia, Australia, and Austria. Those countries are experiencing significant levels of resistance. Like, we're talking, in some of these countries, it's just open rebellion when it comes to the medical mandates that are just kind of sweeping the world at this point. This is very interesting. I think the two that are the most interesting to me are Niger and the Solomon Islands, because Niger has had the French army deployed to quell the rebellion there, and the same thing with the Solomon Islands, with the Australian military being sent in on that mission. So you quite literally have empires going back to their colonies and policing up that actions. There are obviously more countries, more by the minute. By the time this gets posted, I'm sure we'll have a dozen more to add to this list. But just note that even though a lot of the mainstream media sources are kind of burying this and not talking about it, we're talking like Arab Spring level rebellion when it comes to the medical mandates in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Islands, Africa, all these places, right? And then, of course, the rebellion here in the United States against these kind of tyrannical things. So, very interesting to follow. It's going to be interesting to see how this all works out, particularly in Europe, where they have a heavy-handed approach. Now, when it comes to Europe, I will mention the Polish situation with Belarus. So, like I mentioned last time, Poland and Belarus have got, there's kind of a diplomatic spat going on. So, essentially, the rundown of what that situation is this. Belarus is obviously a Russian sort of proxy, right? They were one of the last countries to leave the Soviet Union. The president, Lukashenko, is obviously one of the most infamous dictators in the world. And Belarus is basically on shares a border with Poland. Poland is, the gateway to NATO, right? So what Belarus has been doing, allegedly, it's quite clear that it's kind of obvious what they're doing. Belarus is taking migrants and immigrants from the Middle East and transiting them busing them to the border with Poland and dumping them off. In a lot of cases, giving them weapons and telling them to go assault the Polish border guards. And so there have been a lot of clashes. Poland has strung miles and miles and miles of sea wire and razor wire because of this stuff. And a lot of other European nations are starting to do that too. So what I'm concerned about, this is kind of a thing that I thought of the other day, what I'm kind of concerned about is a sort of new form of Berlin Wall going up. When it comes to this immigration stuff, in Europe, this is a serious deal. In the United States, we have to deal with immigration from Mexico and Central America, South America. It's a little bit of a different story in Europe. I would argue that the story is completely different because you have migrants coming from the Middle East, mostly, into Europe, into the Schengen zone, and the dynamic's different, okay? It's hard to explain to an American audience, but what is interesting is that we clearly have a sort of Cold War relationship kind of starting back over this immigration stuff. You've got, your old post-Soviet bloc countries kind of aligning with Russia, and Russia's happy to let these migrants go through because it kind of ticks off NATO, and that's just kind of like their thing to needle with NATO, right? So it's just kind of the status quo for the past, 70 years. And you've got countries like Poland who are like, hey, we're putting up a fence. You guys want in? And then, it's interesting. I wonder how much of this immigration preparation and mobilizing militaries for immigration and threatening to invoke Articles 4 and 5 of the NATO Charter, I wonder how much of that is genuinely about immigration. And I wonder how much of that is really just a pretext for getting something on the books and moving forces into the area to counter Russia. It would be great. That would be a great thing to do if I were NATO, is to kind of say that, hey, yeah, we're stringing this 800-mile minefield / concertina wire to prevent some guy from Baghdad to walk into Poland. Sounds like overkill to me. In a lot of these cases. So it's going to be interesting to see, is immigration going to be a way for NATO to quietly rearm itself against a potential Russian action? Some people would say no. It's probably a naive thought, honestly, but because NATO really wouldn't need a pretext to do any of that. NATO and Russia and NATO and the post-Soviet countries have gotten pretty good at figuring out what everybody's up to, but I don't know, I just thought it was interesting, so I thought I'd share. And then speaking of the Middle East, moving on to Iran there, the nuclear talks are failing, as one might expect. Iran is just in the mood of do whatever they want. a lot of people, ourselves included, have made the argument that the United States is very diplomatically weak in the international arena, and countries like Iran, they know this, and they're just doing whatever the hell they want. So Iran is like that. North Korea is the same way. China is a little more complex, but really Iran sees that we're not going to do anything about their nuclear development, so they're just going to do it. And also Turkey, moving on to Turkey, is kind of an interesting thing. They are dealing with an economic crisis like no other. So currently they are dealing with currency devaluation. Some might call it a currency crash, right? So the Turkish lira, which is their currency, is experiencing a 20% inflation rate. Yeah, so this is an interesting case to study because it's yet another classic example of how economics is pretty simple when you get past all the smoke and mirrors, especially when it comes to inflation. And Turkey is finding out firsthand pretty quickly what happens when you keep interest rates artificially low for too long. So yeah, that's going to be pretty fascinating to follow because hyperinflation is already setting in Turkey, and this is not good for a NATO member, especially with all the impending conflicts around the world and the tension in Europe right now as is. And then finally, talking about Russia and Ukraine. Honestly, we should probably dedicate an entire freaking several-hour series to this. We've talked about Ukraine in the past and how complex of a situation that is. But currently, Russia has been... there's a lot of activity. So right now, there is a significant level of naval activity. For instance, Russia has deployed the majority of her Black Sea submarine fleet, which is most likely, actually it's almost certainly, in response to the United States sending in the Arleigh Burke herself, DDG-51, to poke around in the very shallow and hard-to-hide-in waters of the Black Sea. So the U.S. has, for the past few months now, I think, had a destroyer hanging out in the Black Sea for a while. It's just been kind of a constant rotation due to the Ukrainian situation and stuff like that. And I think actually the Arleigh Burke has replaced the Porter, the USS Porter, if I remember correctly. But yeah, the Russians have it's Cold War stuff at it again. We're in their waters. They let us know that we're not welcome. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to follow that. But we're seeing a lot of people talk about Russia deploying a significant amount of Pacific Fleet submarines. And so far, haven't been able to figure that out. I'm still waiting on some good open source imagery before I want to talk about that any further, so that I can do the bean counting myself and figure out who's where. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to point that out. Russia's making some moves, and then of course the Ukrainian situation, right? So most people seem to think that the invasion of Ukraine is sort of the full-scale invasion, I should say, of Ukraine, because Ukraine has already been invaded. Like this happened a while ago. Crimea is Russian, essentially, right now. Donetsk is essentially Russian. Donbass, the region, is pretty much Russian at this point. But it's going to be, a lot of people think that there's a full-scale invasion that's impending. Now, it's really hard to talk about this kind of stuff because nobody really knows how far Russia's willing to go. But I can state that it's quite obvious that the facts, right? Russia has built up significant amounts of logistics, significant amounts of vehicles and troops and weapons and stockpiles of ammunition and things like that. That much is clear. And back when everybody, including ourselves, got all spun up about this back a few months ago, when everybody was afraid Ukraine was going to be invaded, and then Russia just said, "Oh, hey, JK, it's just a drill," and then everybody, ourselves included again, said, "No, you just basically practiced the invasion and also left all of your equipment behind so that you can leave it there and pre-stage everything for when you invade in the winter time," which would make sense because Russia has cultural implications of attacking in the wintertime. So again, I guess we'll see how all of this shakes out. That's pretty much all I've got for today. Thank you again, everyone, for sticking around. I know this one's kind of a long one, and it's not really a very much a succinct one. It's a lot of stuff that's very interesting. Not a whole lot of stuff that's particularly valuable at the moment, but hopefully some of the stuff I've talked about here will help get the gears spinning and the thought process working for events in the future. So again, lots of homework, lots of stuff to research further, lots of stuff to keep an eye on moving forward into the future, and hopefully we'll be able to come back and talk some more about some of this stuff, because if we start doing a lot of deep dives, I think that would be kind of interesting to do. So again, that's all I have. Here are the sources slides, slide 1, 2, 3, and 4. Again, not too many sources slides for this time, but again, you can find these slides, wherever we've posted them, usually linked below. But again, thanks everybody for watching. We'll be back at it with another one here pretty soon, and we will see you then. And as always, fight in the shade.